Good day, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dr. Frel, your professor.
Hello class, good morning. Our topic today is about the new growth theory. Here are the expected learning outcomes. One is to discuss how the new growth theory emerged. 2, to identify and explain the models that influence the new growth theory. And 3 is to discuss the principles of the new growth theory. The question is, what is new growth theory? This emphasizes that economic growth results from the increasing returns associated with new knowledge. This is the ability to grow the economy by increasing knowledge rather than labor or capital creates opportunities for nearly boundless growth. All forms of knowledge, from big science to better ways to shoe assert, exhibit these properties and contribute to growth. The new growth theory is a view of the economy that incorporates two important things. One is it views the technological progress as a product of economic activity. While previous theories treated technology as a given or a product of non-market forces, this new growth theory is often called endogenous growth theory because it internalizes technology into a model of how market functions. This is because endogenous growth theory maintains that economic growth is primarily the result of internal forces rather than external ones. It argues that improvements in productivity can be tried directly to foster innovation and more investments in human capital from governments and private sector institutions. While the second one is that new growth theory holds that unlike physical objects, knowledge and technology are characterized by increasing returns, and these increasing returns drive the process of growth. So in short, the essential point of new growth theory is that knowledge drives growth. So in this case class, Paul Romer credited the stimulating new growth theory, but as Romer himself notes, there is really nothing new about the theory itself. So as noted class, Paul Romer developed the theory of endogenous technological chains, in which the search of new ideas by profit-maximizing entrepreneurs and researchers is at the heart of economic growth. So the central notion behind this theory is increasing returns associated with new knowledge and technology. Now let's have the history of this new growth theory. It was in the 1950s when Robert Solow created the theory that addressed this problem, building a model that kept diminishing returns to capital and labor, but which added a third factor, which is technical knowledge, that continued to produce economic productivity and growth. This Solow's model pictured technology as a continuous, ever-expanding set of knowledge that simply became evident over time, not something that was specifically created by economic forces. The theory states that economic growth is the result of three factors. We have labor, capital, and technology. And while an economy has limited resources in terms of capital and labor, the contribution from technology to growth is boundless. Maybe you can also observe as of the present economic situation around the globe that was being propelled by the invention of different technologies that we use every day in our lives. So in this Solow's model class, Technology was assumed to be determined by forces outside the economy and is often referred to as exogenous model of growth. So to clarify things, class, exogenous growth is a key tenet of neoclassical economic theory, stating that economic growth is fueled by technological progress, independent of economic forces. This exogenous growth model factors in production, diminishing returns of capital, saving rates, and technological variables to determine economic growth. So this model by Solow devised was ultimately recognized in 1987 Nobel Prize for Economics became a mainstay of the economic analysis of growth. In general, neoclassical assumptions led us to conclude that markets are generally very competitive and don't tend towards monopolies. That market processes usually result in optimum level of production and allocation. It also implied that we have relatively limited opportunities for government to promote economic ends other than encouraging market competition, providing adequate schooling, and encouraging savings and investment. By that class, the new growth theory challenges the neoclassical model in many important ways. The exogenous growth models developed by Solow and other neoclassical scholars largely didn't try to explain what caused technology to improve over time, implying that technology just happened, led to an emphasis on capital accumulation and labor force improvement as sources of growth. Economists have for a long time agreed that technological process forms a basis for economic progress. In the theories of classical economists like David Ricardo, Karl Marx, and Adam Smith, for them technological change plays crucial roles. Added to this is that of Schumpeter in 1934, when he presented convincing arguments that technological change is the driving force in capitalist development. By that, technological change, as expressed in the residual, was revealed as the main contributor to economic growth. In 1994, Solow traces out of the three stages or waves in the history of growth theory for the last 50 years. He started with that of Harrod-Domar models of economic growth. This Harrod-Domar model is what we called the Keynesian model of economic growth. It is used in development economics to explain an economist's growth rate in terms of the level of savings and of capital. It suggests that there is no natural reason for an economy to have balanced growth. The second is the development of the traditional neoclassical growth model in 1960s. So this neoclassical growth theory is an economic model of growth that outlines how steady economic growth rate results when three economic forces come into play, such as labor, capital, and technology. The theory argues that technological change significantly influences the overall functioning of an economy. And the third is the emergence of the endogenous growth theories in the early 1980s. As we explained earlier, this endogenous growth theory maintains that economic growth is primarily the result of internal forces rather than the external ones. It argues that improvements in productivity can be tied directly to faster innovation and more investments in human capital from governments and private sector institutions. But perhaps the first coherent growth theory, which was stimulated explicitly by the increasing spread of incomes per persons across countries, was that of Arthur Lewis' two-sector model. His model portrayed growth as a transfer of labor from a traditional sector, mainly but not exclusively agricultural, to a modern sector, groupings relatively new processes such as plants and factories. Lewis claimed that there was excess labor in the traditional sector because it operated in a pre-capitalist mode of family enterprises and farms, which use more labor than necessary. In short, this Lewis model describes a path whereby a developing economy can foster the growth of a new capitalist sector, which will employ a growing share of the excess labor available from the subsistence sector. So as discussed, this neoclassical model by Solow has three central assumptions. One is the constant returns to sale, second is the perfect competition, and the third is the exogenous technological change. In this model, the role of investment was being summarized by two equations, that of production function and capital accumulation. This production function is the relationship between output, technology, and capital and labor inputs, while capital stock equation relates to investment to capital accumulation. So as explained, this neoclassical model where growth is determined by accumulation of capital and labor along with technical change. So this technical change is calculated residually and assumed to grow regardless of the pace of accumulation and the factors of production. And accumulation of capital will directly contribute to economic growth based on its share of income. So this Solow's growth model triggered the second wave of interest in growth theory. He abandoned the assumption of fixed coefficients in production and introduced possibilities of substitution in the macro production functions. This demonstrated that full capacity utilization of both labor and capital was not a knife-edge phenomenon that would occur only by chance, as predicted by earlier models. And by that, Solow's model and its subsequent extension changed the approach in growth theory from analysis of conditions for full employment to determinants of growth when full capacity utilization was assumed. So by this, the dominant paradigm for 3 decades was Robert Solow's neoclassical theory, a general one that could apply to any economy, rich or poor. The basic assumption was that all economies had access to the same global technology in the form of a single production function which transformed labor and capital into gross domestic product or total income. But this does mean they all had the same mix. Some with more capital per worker would tend to use more capital-intensive techniques. There are some attempts at endogenizing the growth. These attempts had been made at endogenizing technological change at any early stage. Nelson in 1987 discriminates between appreciative and formal theorizing. Appreciation theorizing denotes the way economists write and talk about phenomena, where the emphasis is on understanding this rather than advancing a specifically theoretical point. While formal theorizing is more self-consciously analytical, more concerned with how a logical structure works. Smokler in 1966 is particularly important within the appreciative tradition. He presents analysis of the role of technological change for economic growth, in which the production of knowledge, the diffusion of knowledge, and the feedback from growth to knowledge creation are discussed. As such, Smokler preceded endogenous growth theory with his emphasis on the two-way causation of technology to growth and back to technology. Another we have Havelmo, who introduced educational level in growth models. In one version of his model, Havelmo assumed a society's educational level accumulate proportionately with time to capture the length of experience of the society considered. In another version, the educational level was assumed to depend on investments in physical capital. He demonstrated that this model could give rise to balanced growth paths, a stationary level, exploding developments, and a rich set of other trajectories in economic development. Then we also have Caldor and Merlis and also Arrow in 1962, who developed the ideas proposed by Havelmo in which know-how and therefore productivity depended on society's economic activities. In Caldor's and Merlis growth model, productivity growth is assumed to depend positively but decreasingly on the level of investments. Now let's have the neoclassical endogenous growth models. The third wave of interest in economic growth was the introduction of the endogenous growth models in the 1980s. These models explicitly analyze production of knowledge's effect on economic growth, and growth's repercussions back to production of knowledge. The first publications in these traditions were by Romer in 1986 and Locus in 1988. These first models were simple as regards endogenizing productivity growth. They assumed that firms' production being dependent both on knowledge acquired by the firms themselves but also by the aggregate knowledge in the economy. And the effect of this assumption was twofold. First, their assumption introduced external effects into the economy. Firms investing for the sake of their own productivity do not take into account the effect of these investments on the aggregate knowledge. Importantly, these models imply too little investment in human capital in decentralized markets. And second, the model were capable of analyzing long-run growth. Solo's growth model predicted stagnating growth in the absence of productivity increase. And comes now the new growth theory. So although many economists worked on the theoretical models of growth after Solow, it wasn't until Paul Romer published his model in 1986 that there was a resurgence of interest in growth. So in contrast to the Solow model, where technological progress is exogenous, new growth theory attempts to explain the sources of technological progress. Three important candidates for the sources of such progress are: one is ideas or through profit-seeking researches, second are international openness, and third is human capital formation. As to these ideas, we all know that research, whether formal and informal, leads to the development of new goods and better goods. Okay, so that will be all, class. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.